Hey all, here OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a closer look at the new B40 5G. This is a mid-range Android smartphone that further expands on the series we saw from last year, including the B30 and B30 Pro. And this time around, the new marquee function is going to be a secondary rear ticker display, measuring nearly 1.6 inches diagonally. It's also an OLED screen, allowing you to act as a viewfinder when taking higher quality photos with the rear camera, as well as giving you access to some quick widgets, including a compass, checking out notifications, kind of like having a smartwatch on the back of your phone. So if you're setting it face down, you're still able to engage with answering calls and see some basic notification status. Now, this seems to be the latest trend in smartphones right now. For example, the recently released Xiaomi 17 Pro Max, which in itself is a competitor to the iPhone 17 Pro Max, also has a ticker display on the rear as well, albeit the iPhone and Xiaomi models are more flagship devices that retail for almost $1,000, compared to the, again, B40 is closer to around $300 officially. So this thing is nearly a third of the price, but obviously we're not getting quite as flagship grade performance. However, it still is very respectable for what it delivers. Case in point, the main display here measures 6.7 inches diagonally. It's a Full HD Plus resolution, 120 Hz ultra-fast refresh rate, again OLED panel with always-on display mode support, and it offers excellent contrast, beautiful looking colors, and slightly curved edges on the left and right sides. Now, I realize that curved screens are a little controversial. Some people love them, others might fear a bit for accidental touches or triggers, but in my testing, I found that the software has been pretty good in terms of even gripping the phone, seems to still be performing quite nicely, and gives it a slightly more modern, sleek look that perhaps seems more expensive than the price here would imply. So at least the curves aren't super dramatic and doesn't really get in the way of usability. It's pretty much the same panel compared to, again, last year's B30 and B30 Pro, which offers a nearly identical footprint as well. There's a small hole punch cutout for the 16 megapixel selfie camera, and then located on the bottom here you have a Type-C port that supports fast 33-watt charging for the 5,000 milliamp hour capacity battery inside. This thing can easily last through a full day, day and a half before you have to really recharge it again. You also find a dual nano SIM card slot, so that you can pop in two cards, one on the front and one on the back. However, it doesn't have a micro SD card slot, as you can see here, so storage space is not going to be expandable on this model. There is some rubber gaskets though that prevents any water from leaking in. It should be a bit more water resistant there, but otherwise comes with 256 gigabytes of built-in system storage, which I think should be sufficient for most folks, even though having expandable storage would be even better. Now the rear, which is crafted out of a polycarbonate matte plastic texture, does have kind of a gradient finish to it. It's kind of a darker shade of blue that almost seems a bit like black at certain angles, looking quite nice. The camera bump here for the screen, as well as the 64 megapixel main camera, LED flash, as well as a macro camera for close-up shots, which also assists when you're in the portrait/bokeh modes as well. And although it slightly protrudes from the edge of the phone, it's not too bad. At least it's completely flat, so it doesn't wobble when you're setting it down onto a desk. You'll also find on the right-hand spine a volume rocker, power on and off key, and it does have an under-display fingerprint scanner, which is relatively fast and responsive. Last year's model didn't have that additional second rear display and instead opted for a kind of third camera lens. So you had one more ultra-wide-angle lens, which is not found on the B40, at least the base model. But overall, a very similar fit and finish as far as the design is concerned. One other slight difference, though, would be the 30 Pro over here did have a stereo speaker setup. So there was some second loudspeaker on the very top of the phone, which is not found on the B40 by comparison. And as kind of a final comparison, here's a few of their other more budget-conscious phones from their lineup in the past, including the A25, rocking a MediaTek Helio G99 processor, which is a 4G LTE chip, compared to the B40 5G, as well as the 30 series are all going to be 5G enabled phones if you want slightly faster connectivity. This one here is using a MediaTek 7025, which is an Octa Core processor. It's a 6nm chip, offering performance that's more or less comparable to some of the Dimensity 1080 phones that we've seen, which is to say it's going to rival a lot of the Snapdragon 600 or 6th Gen and 7th Gen series phones as far as day-to-day use is concerned. Again, the rear panel here is also an OLED screen offering excellent contrast, inky blacks, and you can find a handful of pretty attractive looking custom dials that you're able to push over and show the time information, resolution, which we'll see more under settings in a moment. But yeah, overall it offers a pretty similar size to also the A25 in terms of screen, although this one here had a flat display instead of a curved screen, which some folks actually might prefer. But again, it's a slightly slower processor by comparison, with most of the components in terms of storage, RAM, all being slightly more dialed back. And then you also have the N10 as well as N20, which are essentially their most budget-conscious devices currently available. Both the N10 as well as this N20, for example, are using a LCD screen, which has thicker bezels compared to the more contrast-rich AMOLED screens found on all of their other devices that we have in front of us over here. What I will say though is the N20 also has dual cameras on the rear instead of 3 camera lenses, but instead opted for an ultra-wide-angle lens, which I actually think is a slightly more versatile choice, and I would have preferred to see them retain the strategy on here as well instead of the macro, but it is what it is. I guess one slight advantage of the cheaper N20 is actually it retains a 3.5mm headphone jack. Ironically enough, the more flagship-grade devices tend to omit that in lieu of just using wireless headphones with Bluetooth. Before we take a closer look at the software and performance, just a brief look at the packaging here, recapping some of the specs, including 8GB of RAM, and you also see it's technically labeled as gray, although, like we said, maybe it's a little closer to a darker blue in person. Now, inside we have all the accessories you need to get started, unlike some of the flagship devices from Apple, cough cough, that no longer includes even a charger in the box. On this one, you have a TPU case for added protection that is included, some stickers, as well as a 33-watt charger, so you're able to reach the maximum charging speed that the phone is capable of delivering, a USB Type-C cable, as well as a SIM card ejector pin. And here's what that included TPU case looks like. It adds a bit more grip. You can still see some of the texture underneath if you shine it across the light, in addition to providing a little bit more protection on the screen as well, slightly raising the corners and edges if you're putting it face down, adding a bit more grip and preventing the screen from getting scratched, which by the way also comes with a factory pre-applied screen protector as well. So again, all the goodies that you need to get started are going to be thrown in the box. Software-wise, the B40 is running on a pretty clean version of Android 15. There hasn't been that much bloatware or additional customization going on, which is a good thing. So you'll find access to all the Google Essentials, including the Google Play Store, the Gemini Assistant. There is also FM radio support on here as well, which is nice to have, although it seems like you need to plug in headphones to act as the antenna. But like we said, there isn't a standard 3.5mm headphone jack. So what that means is you need to plug in a Type-C to 3.5mm adapter, which I guess is one accessory that would have been nice to see included in the box if they did want to throw the software feature in, but it is what it is. There's also a sound recorder here. Here's a quick test of what the microphone quality sounds like on the NUU B40 5G. The microphone quality sounds like on the NUU B40 5G. Crisp sounding audio thanks to the noise cancellation mics, actually working very well for picking up your voice. It is an unlocked smartphone at the end of the day, so in the US, for example, T-Mobile is going to work without any issues, although AT&T in recent years has been a little bit more picky, finicky when it comes to having to look at whitelisted or approved devices for it to function on their network. On a more general note, let's jump into the camera next, and from here we have a pretty similar layout compared to their previous phones that we've seen. There is going to be AI scene detection, so for example, if you're pointing it at nature, if we kind of move it over here, it's identified it as greenery, as you can tell there, and it's going to apply a little bit more processing or color contrast to match the scene, essentially acting as an intelligent auto. There's also auto HDR, and you can further play around with geotagging as well as grid line composition and find a few more built-in filters and effects as well if you want to apply these instead of processing it in post. Now, in terms of video, it's still the same as on the B30, which is to say maximum resolution here is going to be 2K instead of 4K, which seems to be more of a limitation on this Dimensity chip rather than on NUU's part. So it's decent enough, I would say, for most cases. The camera interface also allows you to choose between kind of a simplified layout or a slightly more advanced layout that you can swipe up to access even more functionality, including dual view video that will capture using both the front and rear facing cameras simultaneously if you're maybe vlogging, and also in Ultra HD mode, which will now capture at the full 64 megapixels, which allows you to zoom in and see a bit more detail. So case in point, this one will take around 30 megabytes of space compared to a typical shot will actually be cropped down to around 16 megapixels, taking up around 8 megabytes instead. However, one thing to keep in mind is even though the 64 megapixel mode allows you to, again, zoom in more, so you can see that's the point of the tree we can see, versus in the normal mode you can zoom in to this point. However, with the normal mode, it allows you to apply the HDR as well as AI scene detection modes, which aren't going to be found in the 64 megapixel mode. And so you can see colors aren't going to be quite as vibrant, for example, although it allows you to crop in a little bit more. You'll also find a few more tabs here for a film simulation mode, so even more filters to play around with, including kind of a film grain simulation, black and white, giving you a slightly more dramatic look, as you can see there, which is not bad. There's also Google Lens integration in the camera app as well, so you can scan in barcodes and objects for searching them up. You'll also find a portrait mode for some more added bokeh, as well as a beauty mode, allowing you to change the intensity of hiding any skin imperfections. Night mode, which allows you to stay still, increasing the exposure time for a couple more seconds to let in more light if you are shooting in darker environments. A couple of final modes here also include a macro mode, which will also get closer to objects as a secondary functionality, as you can see here, which is fun to play with, although again the resolution here is going to be much lower than the primary lens. You can also find a panorama mode, slightly getting you wider angle shots, as well as a pro mode here that allows you to change properties like ISO, white balance, shutter speed, even the focus distance can all be set manually, which is nice to see, and these same controls can be found in the video mode as well. It's more than serviceable for just some casual snap-and-go photography, as you can see here, with still very vibrant-looking colors in kind of a Samsung way, but that's not a bad thing, I would say, in this case. Zooming in still gets you sufficient detail and clarity with some natural bokeh there in the background if you're looking at some macro shots, as you can see there. So doing all right, I would say. It's actually pretty responsive, fast enough to shoot with, and the HDR does make a difference in terms of still boosting some of the contrast in the shadows. So the sky here, you can still see the clouds and some of the gradient colors when it comes to some basic snap-and-go photography. Here's another flower shot, just zooming a little bit closer. I find myself mostly satisfied. Again, the display here I think is an excellent quality panel for the price. That was something that really impressed me on last year's B30, and although it's still mainly the same panel as before, as the saying goes, there's no need to fix what's not broken. Previously, I described it as a nearly flagship-grade display on more of an affordable smartphone. I think that's still mostly true here, coupled with ample brightness. Even if there's a bit of light around you, as you can see, it remains pretty visible. So all of those attributes remain true. There is an auto mode, by the way, that can intelligently switch or dial itself down to 60 Hz depending on if you're idling or if you're in a certain app that doesn't require you to push the frame rate quite as quickly. However, it's not an LTPO panel, which might be the one aspect that's not quite truly flagship, I would say. So it doesn't really idle all the way down to just 1 Hz, for example, but still a beautiful looking screen. As for more advanced system settings, you can check out, again, storage space remaining, so you have well over 200 gigabytes free out of the box for you to still install apps as well as take photos. And under display, this is where we can change the aforementioned refresh rate modes. Lift to wake as well as the always-on display modes can also be applied. You have a couple of options for the always-on clock, in addition to a few other styles that you're able to display here as well. So if we tap to turn this on, you can even change the color of the text in the background there as well. You can see a faint outline of the clock information being persistently shown. And because on AMOLED screens, technically no pixels are being emitted on a black background, it still is able to save a bit more power compared to a always-on display with an LCD panel, for example, albeit turning on this mode will still shorten the battery life by a little bit more. Now further down below here, there's going to be Dura speed. This is pretty typical for most MediaTek phones. You're able to kind of optimize, for example, if you're running a game or a more power-intensive app, it'll try to restrict any background processes when you're running those apps to give you the best performance, kind of like a gaming mode. And under mini screen, this is where you can find the rear ticker display, selecting other dials that we saw there from before. Now it looks like currently you aren't able to push your own photo as a custom background wallpaper, as well as there doesn't seem to be a dial gallery for downloading even more options that we sometimes see on smartwatches and fitness trackers, for example. So that might be something nice to consider perhaps in a future software update. However, I do like the current selection of faces here, including analog as well as digital options, all looking quite nice. And it does also act as a pedometer function as well on some of these dials, showing you how many steps you've walked as another health function. Backlight level for brightness, as well as double tap to turn on or off, or you can also activate a gesture where you flip over the phone to automatically turn on. Now under the system settings here, you're also able to find the extended RAM functionality, so you can set up to, again, 6 gigs of more virtual RAM combined with the 8 gigs of built-in physical RAM. It's not exactly the same thing, but slightly helps if you're doing more extreme multitasking, borrowing some of the system storage to act as simulated RAM over here. So it's more of a difference in the hardware design more than anything else. If you prefer that because you're taking lots of photos with the rear camera, then perhaps you might prefer the B40. However, if you want a slightly more conventional smartphone experience, I would say the 30 Pro from before is still a perfectly great option that is still worth considering in its own right. So both of these devices are kind of existing in parallel, I would argue, rather than being a really next-gen upgrade necessarily. But yeah, otherwise a very clean and fluid software experience for the most part, and you're able to find the Google Newsfeed here on the left, similar to on a Google Pixel device as well. Right, so in turning the volume down there, takeaway is it does get sufficiently loud, but like we mentioned, it is a little bit of a shame since the previous devices did have stereo speakers for some added immersion, or they could have used, I think, the earpiece as a secondary loudspeaker for a bit more balanced audio, but it certainly does work in a pinch, and again, the display really is the highlight here, which is still beautiful to look at, vibrant looking colors when it comes to consuming media, remaining quite enjoyable. Again, the curved screens aren't too dramatic, so it's not like it spills out or distorts the image either, remaining a pretty fluid and enjoyable experience. The antenna reception quality also seems to be quite strong thanks to the polycarbonate frame, so I was getting mostly full bars with Wi-Fi even though I'm a little bit further away from the router. Same thing goes with T-Mobile cellular reception as well, so no problems in terms of staying connected. This particular Dimensity chip, the 7025, similar to the 7050, I think is doing alright for a mid-ranger in its class, without too much thermal throttling issues to speak of. Now, one other aspect though that's kind of similar to the previous B30 series would be the haptic vibration engine is still an area on some of the more mid-rangers and budget devices which are not going to be quite as precise and satisfying perhaps as the true flagships of the world, but certainly it still is functional, and this is a quick test of the web browser, so let's jump into the desktop site, demanding a slightly more complex page with more videos and ads available, but you can see how loading speeds are still quite fast, as you can tell here. So this is a chipset that will more than be sufficient when it comes to just daily navigation, thanks to the plentiful RAM inside. And honestly, the same thing can be said when it comes to doing a little bit of casual gaming. There's nothing really stopping you from downloading any title, any social media app that you need from the Google Play Store. Everything, of course, will be fully supported here. So that includes even Asphalt, PUBG, Minecraft, and the like. Simpler titles, tap and go style, like stock over here, is going to work flawlessly, as you can tell, without really missing a beat. Remaining quite cool during operation, unless you're pressing it really hard for longer than, say, an hour. It might get a little bit warmer, but generally speaking, it remained a pretty consistent performer in my testing, which was good. So although it obviously isn't a gamer phone necessarily, primarily in the GPU department, I would say it still gets by alright when it comes to casual gaming. There's really nothing you aren't able to run, everything's still feeling pretty smooth for the most part, as long as you have your expectations tempered that it is a mid-range phone at the end of the day. And similarly, if you're using it for, again, productivity, doing a bit of reading, entertainment, as well as WhatsApp, Facebook, Kindle app, all of these services are going to run on here without too many problems as well. In fact, it's actually quite beautiful to see thanks to this display, which offers super fluid refresh rate, as you can tell there. So although you may occasionally see a couple of drop frames here and there, when you're first loading up a more demanding app, after a couple of seconds it tends to stabilize and work quite nicely. So there we have it. That's more or less it as far as our hands-on review of the NUU B40 5G. One of my observations is that the smartphone space has become increasingly competitive and more difficult for smaller players over the years. We've seen so many brands just throw in the towel and quit altogether, whether it's former titans like HTC, Nokia, LG, just to name a few. Even some of the smaller brands are starting to exit as well. So it's good to see that NUU is still around, because having more options is ultimately a good thing for us as consumers. Similar to Blue, they also have certain partnerships with US carriers as well, including Tello that I've seen in the past. So I guess one advantage is if you're based in the US, support might be a little bit easier compared to importing an international phone from brands like Xiaomi, for example, that don't really have any headquarters or offices located nearby. Granted, their more premium devices like this B40 and B30 Pro are still not going to be true absolute flagships in the entire landscape of devices. They're more like mid-rangers, but still offers a beautiful display, a pretty sleek and stylish design, as well as getting all the essentials right when it comes to making calls with a very clean and crisp sounding microphone with noise cancellation, good reception quality, as well as fast and fluid performance for the most part. Again, I don't necessarily think that the B40 is a one-to-one upgrade in the traditional sense compared to the B30 from before, since that was the arguably slightly more conservative device, using a additional ultra-wide-angle lens, having stereo speakers, NFC, which actually might be a little more practical, but this one offers a bit more style points. But yeah, I would say it's another attractive enough option if you're curious about trying out a slightly different brand compared to some of the giants and titans in the industry. So you can check out more details if you're interested in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the rather sleek and stylish new B40 5G.